Now I want to unpack two different kinds of conditioning, which is another way of saying learning. But I want to unpack them over and over again, just so that through repetition you can get comfortable with the concepts. And I'm going to do it in a fairly surface sort of way first, with the two kinds of conditioning. And let me just put them up. We've got classical conditioning, which is a linking of stimuli. And then we also have operant conditioning, which is a response and a consequence. And then we also have social or observational learning, which we will tackle at a later point in time. So the keys to understanding classical conditioning is what is pictured in this picture or this illustration above. Is that you have stimuli 1, which is lightning, and then it is paired with stimuli 2, which is thunder, and it results in a response of some sort. Now, this formula, if you will, is the basis on which classical conditioning occurs. What eventually happens is that this stimuli falls away, and what you have is stimuli 1 results in this response. So it's this addition that is the key to classical conditioning. So you have the addition of two stimuli or connection of two stimuli that are part of classical conditioning. And the second one is where the second one is the involuntary nature of the response. And that's the key when you're trying to understand classical conditioning. Generally, it is with or the response is involuntary nature. Is involuntary in nature. I'm sorry. It happens, in other words, naturally. So when you hear or see lightning, you're automatically covering your ears, or a kid would, because they know what's coming. And there's a certain predictive nature because of this connection that is part of classical conditioning. The key to keep in mind is that in our diagram up here, this falls away, because this is the trigger point that leads to the particular behavior of wincing. Now, what do parents oftentimes do in terms of making this less fearsome for kids is that they engage them in a game of prediction. And so or a game of prediction or explanation. If your parents, sometimes we will teach our kids or have taught our kids that lightning, you start counting and you can see how far away the lightning is, because the speed of light is faster than the speed of sound, and so they start counting. Well, essentially, this distracts attention away from the wince or the crying or the fear or anything else, and it makes it manageable. And that's a good example, really, of what we do in helping our kids manage the world around them. We make it knowable by having them be able to predict, and that's a learning process, and that's key to classical conditioning. And that's just a brief overview. We'll get into it in a little bit more detail in a minute. Now, let me turn my attention now to operant conditioning. Now, what we just finished was the classical conditioning, the connection of two stimuli to a response where one stimuli eventually falls away and we're left with the one that actually starts the process, if you will. So classical conditioning, and it's two stimuli, two associated stimuli that lead to some response. Now, in operant conditioning, the paradigm changes entirely. And in operant conditioning, in a sense, the whole thing starts with the response. And so, as is illustrated below, is a response is provided, elicited, if you want, or automatically given. And that response is then met with some consequence. And if that consequence is positive, what happens is the frequency of the response increases, and it continues to be met with a positive consequence, and the process continues. So in some respects, operant conditioning is a simpler model in a sense. The problem is how do we get that first response? Now, we can cue it, and that's what cue the response, and that's what parents actually do, is that they say, what do you say? Yeah, and you probably automatically respond when I say it that way. So we cue the response, and then we reinforce it to have it happen more frequently. That's what we refer to as a consequence. Okay? So classical conditioning is two stimuli that are associated together and lead to a particular response. One of the stimuli trigger this response automatically. The second stimuli is added into it, associated together, so that the number one is associated with number two. Number two doesn't have to exist for number one to bring about this response. In operant conditioning, we have to find a way, or we see the response we want, and we provide a certain consequence. Oftentimes you will hear or have heard this phrase of catch your kids being good. And in a sense, that is an operant conditioning response, is that we look for the behavior that we want, the positive behavior, and we provide a positive consequence to it, which by nature increases that response's likelihood. And that's the operant conditioning element to it here.